Welcome to A Ride on the Outside. MMA is full of people on the inside, but what about the ones that watch from beyond? Welcome to the MMA Outsiders with Tom Albano and Zain Bando on the Empty the Bench Podcast Network.
Welcome one, welcome all. This is MMA Outsiders episode number 5. Tom Albano here along with Zain Bando. And Zain, we've got a big week this week. We are counting down the days. We are just days away from UFC 279. Yes, the next UFC pay-per-view is here already. Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. No title on the line, but a very interesting card nonetheless. We'll go through our usual. I'm Tom Albano. You can find my work at Fanside MMA. That's Zain Bando. You can find his work at bj.com. And of course, make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you get all the notifications for everything here on the Empty the Bench Network, including MMA Outsiders. So, Zain, we have a lot to talk about. We've got UFC Paris. We've got UFC 279 coming up. We got more news on Nate Diaz, but we will begin this episode with news that has broken over about the last 24 hours or so. Obviously, we talked about this a lot last week, so don't want to get too much in depth. You could find our discussion on it on last week's episode of the MMA Outsiders. You can watch that here on the Empty the Bench Network too. Jake Paul, Anderson Silva, that boxing match that was long discussed, is now, it's got the green light. It's good to go. October 29th. That's a Saturday. I think I mentioned last week the UFC running a very small fight night event. So Jake Paul versus Anderson Silva is going to be in the spotlight. And I believe they said it's going to take place in Phoenix.
Yeah, so this fight is official. And even before I get into that, this might be our biggest episode to date in the history of this show. So I'm locked and loaded and ready for the ride. To start off, Jake Paul and Anderson Silva, official for October 29th. It looks like, I don't want to say it was a wish, but it looks like Dana White's proclamation of Jake Paul fighting somebody legitimate has now come true, because Jake Paul will be boxing Anderson Silva. And as Dana White has said multiple times, including in last week's Dana White Contender Series press scrum, that if Jake Paul wants to fight a real guy, then Anderson Silva is a real fight. And look at what we have. And, it's going to be interesting because, as you said, the UFC is a smaller fight night card. I believe we mentioned that Edson Barboza would be landing that card, so it's going to be a much smaller weekend of combat sports appetite. We broke this down kind of a lot last week. I'm still sticking with my same prediction as I did a week ago. It should be interesting. It should be a spectacle. I saw it built as the biggest combat event of the year, which I don't believe that for a second. There are plenty of other fights to look forward to and other promotions that are not that, obviously including the potential mega fight between Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, but that's either here nor there. I think I'm more excited for the build up of this fight than the actual fight itself, because I think if they can market it and milk it the right way, Showtime is going to have some mass chaos on their hands. That's what I think.
Just as long as Showtime is ready for all the pay-per-view purchases and their streams don't crash.
True, very true. Showtime has had a history of that in the past. A la Conor McGregor, Floyd Mayweather. There were tons of people that were not able to purchase that fight. Thankfully, I was not one of those people. I was able to watch the whole card without a hitch.
Wasn't Paul Askren, Paul Woodley one of those two also?
Well, I guess you could say Paul Woodley, but Paul Askren was on Triller, so I don't know how.
Oh, that's right. That was Triller. That was Triller.
Yeah, I don't know how poor the Triller streams were, but I remember people complaining about not being able to buy either Paul Woodley fight. More so the second one and then the first one, from what I can remember. But yeah, Showtime has had their hiccups in the past, and it'll be interesting. It kind of sucks though, from a financial perspective, that they couldn't keep that card in New York. But hey, it's Arizona. They're sanctioning the fight. You and I both know very well that kind of those West Coast area states kind of really and truly is the Wild West. So this is not a surprise to me that a state like Arizona wants to endorse this kind of fight. And honestly, it's one of those fights where people aren't going to care who's on the undercard of this. People are going to tune in for the main event. I could guarantee you. I don't have the schedule pulled up in front of me, but I could guarantee you that every Saturday, just kind of looking back at this past weekend, if the first real weekend of college football is anything as crazy as last weekend, then I think we're in for a crazy day on that actual day to cap off a massive day in sports. But yeah, I am sticking with my same prediction. I really do hope the fight stays on. I do have that eerie feeling in the back of my head that Anderson Silva Jake Paul may not happen, and it may get pulled a couple days before. I really hope this jinx doesn't happen, but I don't know if I'm feeling it as much as the Jake Paul supporters are, to put it lightly.
Zain, all I'm going to say is if this fight gets canceled, especially if it's a couple of days before and the card falls apart, a la Jake Paul, Hasim Rahman Jr., you are going to be the blame.
Yeah,
you have the curse. You have unleashed the curse.
Yeah, probably, and then I will get slandered on Twitter for the next week. Which, by the way, I'm ready. I'm ready. I'll take the bait. I'll yell at all the retractors. I'll say it was my fault. But I am making just a little bit of a small proclamation that don't be surprised if this fight doesn't fall through. Does fall through. It's one of those fights where I'll believe it. I'll believe it when I see them at the weigh-ins.
Just remember, guys. Yeah, he was pointing down to it. Sam Bando 99.
Yeah, you can come. You can terrorize me if this fight gets canceled.
All right, let's talk about UFC Paris. Kind of a let's focus in on that main event because it was a pretty decent show. But my God, that main event, that might have to be the most entertaining heavyweight fight that I have seen this year. Ciryl Gane, Tuivasa, the two just clobbering one another until Gane got the knockout in the third round.
Yeah, I mean, at first I thought you were going to say that it was the best heavyweight fight you had ever seen, and then I was going to be like, "Whoa, wait a minute!" But no. Yeah, as for this year, I agree with you. First off, you have to give all the respect in the world to Tuivasa, flying all the way into enemy territory, knocking Ciryl Gane down early in the fight, nearly winning the fight at one point, to eating the most vicious heavyweight body I've ever seen, and still staying upright. It was a classic heavyweight fight that had shades of Mark Hunt, Bigfoot Silva, for example, where you could just feel the buzz and the energy in the whole arena. And I gotta say, the celebration of all of those people that had waited years to see the UFC in their country, they lost it, and rightfully so. They should have. It looked like all of those people had a great time. That was a high level heavyweight fight, and Ciryl Gane puts himself in prime position for a massive fight coming up, either for gold on the line for an interim heavyweight title or for the undisputed title, depending on what the madness of the heavyweight division brings. I just want to ask you, Tom, Tuivasa had come into this fight on a massive win streak. He had really captivated the fans, knocked out Greg Hardy, beat Derek Lewis, kind of had this meteoric rise where maybe, I guess you could say, a year ago, I'd say in January of 2021, he was a relatively unknown fighter, and now he's easily become one of the most popular fighters in the UFC. Do you think that this fight in any way, shape, or form downgrades his stock at all? Because personally, I don't.
Absolutely not. Not at all. I mean, if we're going by literal definition when it comes to the UFC rankings, I mean, he fell to number 4 while Curtis Blades went up to number 3. But I mean, am I really going to put any stock in that? I mean, compared to the win streak he's been on compared to the level of heart that he displayed in that octagon, the fact that he took so many of those shots, and it was basically, Ciryl Gane had a great strategy of, attacking the body in order to get to the head. And Gane, you got to give all the credit in the world for, like you said, pulling it off, having a great strategy, and getting the win in front of the home country crowd. But Tai Tuivasa, I mean, like you said, this guy was on a win streak. This guy displayed so much passion and so much great fighting spirit in the octagon. The fans love him and his shoey celebrations. He was also willing to play the bad guy. Like, people loved him, but the French crowd obviously booed him because they wanted Gane to win. And speaking of entertaining, I mean, coming out to, all these entrance songs that he comes out to, specifically this past weekend coming out to Moulin Rouge.
Yeah, that was if you guys know Tuivasa well, that shouldn't have come as a surprise at all. It certainly wasn't to me. He likes to instigate wherever he's at, and I just thought it was hilarious.
So the only thing would be what is next for each of these individuals, because you say Gane is now in big contention for, maybe an interim fight, an interim title fight, or another title shot. I don't know if the UFC is going to want to run Ngannou versus Gane 2
Okay,
so soon.
Wait, let me throw this at you, because there's a caveat here.
Okay.
What if the UFC decides to do for Jon Jones's first fight in the heavyweight division, they make Ciryl Gane versus Jon Jones for the interim UFC heavyweight championship in December?
I would be for that. I would be for that because, as we mentioned, Zan, we've been talking about maybe in December Jones versus Stipe might happen, but now those talks have basically been dead, and it seems like with the UFC showing Francis on camera and everything and promoting him as the heavyweight champion that, maybe a deal has been done and maybe he is in the good graces again. So at this point, I will say the ball right now is in the courts of Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic because
and to piggyback off of what you just said about Francis being there, that was the most surprising part to me, is how much screen time he got, just considering that just 5 or 6 months ago there was so much bad blood with Francis's management and Dana, and now you could be right to where they're inching closer to getting a deal done that both parties are happy with. But now you can continue on with what you were saying. I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's okay. It's a great point. It is a great point. That wasn't that long ago that those two were clashing, and we entertained the idea not even a whole month ago. If Jones versus Miocic happens, maybe they take the title off of Ngannou if a deal wasn't reached and put that on, a vacant title on the line. But now the Jones Miocic talks basically have gone nowhere, it seems. And like I said, the ball is in the courts of Miocic and Jones, because the thing is, if Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic don't come to terms, not just with each other, but don't come to terms with the UFC, and both fall off the map again, maybe the UFC doesn't have another choice but to do a Gane versus Miocic. I mean, a Gane versus Ngannou rematch, because
actually, Gane versus Miocic is interesting too, because of how much Jon Jones has sat out. And I think the biggest mystery in this whole thing is, where has Stipe Miocic even been?
I was just going to say, man, because we're talking about how long Jon Jones has sat out, and fair enough, but it's now been a year and a half since we've seen Stipe the octagon. The last time we saw him was when he lost the title to Ngannou.
Right, and I can't tell you this for certain, because that would mean that we were changing history, but I am almost positive that if Stipe had beat Francis again for the second time, that the outlook of the heavyweight division would be much different in September of 2022, meaning right now than what it currently is. I actually think, as unfortunate as it sounds, had Stipe won that fight, I think we would have a lot more clarity in this division than what we do right now, because a lot of it seems like there's so much stuff on the back burner, and it just felt like there were so many implications going into that fight, and honestly, we can't prove who the UFC would rather want to win, but I really do think from a business perspective, the UFC got exactly what they wanted with Gane fighting Tuivasa and obviously beating him, because now the dominoes are in a row where you can make all of these fights against one another and they would draw huge business, of course. So it's going to be interesting. But if you were to ask me right now what I think is going to happen with this heavyweight division, my prediction is that Francis Ngannou is not going to fight until February or March of 2023. I do think he will still remain the champion, and there is going to be another interim title fight attached. And I actually do think that that this Ciryl Gane John Jones fight is now going to be the fight that the UFC is looking at. I really think, as much as I hate to say it, because Stipe was a great champion, I really do think that Gane Jones is a lot more compelling stylistically than Miocic Jones, just because there's such a height advantage with Jones, and the reach is so compromised between the two.
And honestly, we need to see more of Stipe in the octagon. Like, I understand he was the heavyweight champion. I understand he has the case for the heavyweight GOAT title, but he doesn't have, like John Jones, we have seen for years. We've seen him in the UFC since 2008, 2009, and we've seen his rise to the top. But Miocic, and actually Jones technically never lost a championship in the octagon. Miocic has lost the belt. Miocic has lost the belt twice in the octagon, once to DC and the other to Ngannou. So I understand his case of him always wanting to be in like title fights and such, but right now there's a case of he's got to fight.
Yeah, and the big question now is, who does he fight? Because I mean, do you think realistically that Tuivasa coming off a loss fighting Stipe is a fight that you would entertain? Just considering where they currently are in the rankings, and not to mention the fact that they are both coming off losses, and Tuivasa is, one of the next guys that the UFC is trying to bring up, because I think they want nothing more than to see Tuivasa in a title fight of sorts.
And not just that, but like we were also saying that Tuivasa, his stock didn't go down with this loss because it was such an entertaining fight. It was probably heavyweight fight of 2022, like I said earlier. And the other thing is, when you're talking about Jones and Miocic, he's had pay-per-views that have drawn 750,000.
Yeah, he's never drawn a million. And to be honest with you, I personally don't think he's a draw compared to what Jones or Francis can achieve.
I was gonna say not compared to Jones, because Jones we've seen Jones like
with DC Gustafsson. He's been in massive fights. He's fought Machida. He's fought Belfort. He's fought just a who's who list of some of the best light heavyweights of all time, and he's been in some massive fights. Probably the biggest was the DC rivalry for sure. And like you could even, I mean, I'm sure they're probably looking up, but Jones has been in a couple pay-per-views that did massive numbers.
Right, like I don't see one for him for in the million mark, but I see his highest is Cormier versus Jones 2, UFC 214, 860,000 buys, and I think that's just domestic.
Right, so who knows how many people actually saw that fight?
And then UFC 182 was 800,000. Trying to find where Stipe, Jones versus Evans, 700,000. Jones Gustafsson 2, 700,000. I could have sworn
and I can guarantee you that rematch between Jones and Gustafsson would have not drawn 700,000 if that first fight was not what it was.
So Miocic Cormier 3 only did 500,000. Really, I thought that it did a lot higher than that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at the rest of the card. It was probably a factor because
Okay,
they were building it up as that is the marquee fight on UFC 251.
okay,
So
but kind of furthers our point then that with Stipe out for so long, trying to get a fight with Jones, that Stipe doesn't have, let's say, the leverage that a John Jones would have.
exactly. So to kind of wrap up this portion a little bit, if you were to put on a scale right now, odds or probability or however you want to put it, Jones Miocic happens in 2022 or does not happen in 2022?
Does not happen.
Interesting. Okay, we'll see how this story develops, and as you stated a couple of times now, the ball is in Jones and Stipe's camp now. So if they want the fight, they can make the fight. So
other action from UFC Paris: Robert Whittaker defeating Marvin Vettori by unanimous decision. This was, I think, it kind of furthers what we were talking about last week, Sam. Robert Whittaker is kind of, I'll make a comparison. I don't know, Sam, if you've ever heard this expression in baseball, the quadruple A player. That basically in the minor leagues, they can, mash and be unstoppable at bats, but then the majors that they kind of struggle. And that's where I think Robert Whittaker kind of is at right now, because obviously he lost the 2 times to Izzy, but everybody else in the middleweight division, he's just, taking care of business. Because this one was kind of one-sided.
For sure. And we did get this prediction exactly right. A week ago, we said that Robert Whittaker would win by decision, and of course he did. Of course he did. So anybody who had that, congratulations. I hope you cashed well. And if you guys have been paying attention, that was part of our best bet segment a week ago. We're trying to get better at that. But yeah, as you said, once he gets to those higher level fights where, gold is on the line, he's tended to struggle. And, some people, think to this day that those Romero fights, specifically the second one, were super controversial, and who could blame them? The thing is, though, is I'm not saying Marvin Vettori is a bad fighter by any means, but Marvin Vettori, it just doesn't seem like when he gets to, the number 2 guy in the world or number 1 that, and I could be totally wrong, but it seems like over the last year and a half, his heart doesn't seem to be, in it for wanting to really contend for a title. I just think he's more so talked than anything else. I'd like to see him improve, but I just don't think he followed the game plan very well, and he should have used his striking more, and he didn't, and it cost him the fight.
Usually, to kind of put what you're trying to say into shorter words, you're saying he's not elite. He's not one of the elite at middleweights. Like right now, the elite at middleweight is Izzy, Whittaker, and honestly, I'm looking at these names like Cannonier and Brunson and Pereira, and I don't know if I can even say those are elite. It's like the top 2 are Izzy and Whittaker, but we can't just throw, as much as I say, and you have said, that we can watch Figueiredo versus Moreno, any day of the week, at least that flyweight division is stacked with talent from champion to 15. And I'm not saying middleweight isn't, but it seems like champion and 1 are a step above everybody else, unless we see come November Alex Pereira if he defeats Israel Adesanya at the Garden.
Right. It also seems like, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it really does seem like middleweight, more specifically middleweight and welterweight, where if you look at champion and the number 1 guy, they're so far above that it's like, who else? Well, I guess you could say number 1 until Usman lost, but it's kind of like where it's like you look at champion and number 1, and it's like they're so far above everyone else that every other fight just doesn't seem as entertaining because we've seen the movie several times before. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with Whittaker next. I mean, the thing is like he's already down 0-2 to the champ. Is the third fight something that the UFC really wants to do? Because he didn't win the second fight, so now the third fight just doesn't feel as big. But it's almost like the UFC doesn't really have a choice.
Well, Zan, I'll counter that. If you're the UFC, we talk about, maybe UFC rooting for certain things. Do you think then Dana and the UFC are maybe rooting for Alex Pereira to win the title at the Garden in November?
Yeah. I mean, I could easily see it. I mean, they've hyped up that guy ever since the day they signed him, and it would make for a really compelling first title defense to do Whittaker versus potentially in Australia at some point in 2023. Absolutely.
And freshens up the division, because if Alex Pereira defeats Izzy with Izzy's star power and his reign, obviously they would have to have a rematch. Unless of course Izzy maybe gets knocked out in like 20 seconds or something. But I was just saying that from the perspective of maybe then it reopens the division and freshens everything up, because then you can do Pereira Whittaker, Pereira versus Cannonier, Pereira versus Vettori, Pereira versus Brunson.
Yeah, and have Pereira lap all the guys that Izzy once defeated. And then potentially, if Pereira isn't good enough, then you might see some tic-tac-toe with the titles switching hands if Pereira happens to win. And then there's this round robin effect, which would make the next 3 years of 185 very, very, very interesting. I know we're getting into some crazy hypotheticals, but honestly, you never know what could happen in this sport. And of course, Leon Edwards called this shot with under a minute to go, and look at what happened. So you never know. Nonetheless, Robert Whittaker gets it done by decision against Vettori. Were there any other fights that stood out to you on the card? I know I tweeted a video of Nurmagomedov's kick that kind of blew up a little bit. Was there anything that stood out to you? How much? I know you said you were busy on Saturday. How much of the card did you actually watch?
I was able to watch some of it afterward. 3 words, Zan. Benoit Saint Denis.
Yeah, he was ultra impressive, and that was one of those. I know I never like to say this, but it seemed to me like that one for sure could easily be the block of the week, and sure enough, it was.
Yeah, he was absolutely entertaining. Egger got the night off pretty well with her second round submission. As you mentioned, Magomedov, that front kick was brutal, and that came against Dustin Stufulvis, who I'm trying to see if he has kickboxing. Yeah, I was gonna say, doesn't he have kickboxing experience? Obviously, not he's also got jiu-jitsu experience, but still, I mean, you're able to front kick and finish a guy who's doing kickboxing in 19 seconds. And I saw an interesting stat that basically, like, somebody with the last name of Magomedov has only lost like 4 times in the UFC. Anybody with the last name of Magomedov who's competed.
Yeah. You're right. I had those two confused, but yeah, I mean any Russian name that's like that, you know that more than likely they're gonna do something a little crazy. I have to ask you this though. I don't know if you caught the end of this, but at the post fight media scrum, they had David Shaw in place of Dana White, and he kind of runs the whole international scene for the UFC. And there were some questions about, some other places that they wanted to go back to when the world opened up. Some of them were Scandinavia, Canada. They wanted to hit South America a little bit more. Is there one place that you'd like to see?
I want to see the UFC hit Italy. I know they said they're having arena difficulties, but I see Bellator hit Italy. I'm like, why can't the UFC go to Italy?
Well, I just don't. I mean, I understand Vettori's the biggest star out of there, but I think they're looking for a real mega star before they really push that market, because they don't want to have Vettori fight somebody that everybody in the MMA community knows that he can easily win. They want to put him or somebody else from Italy up against somebody that will actually give them a real fight. Well, I think that's why they're really holding out on the market, because they don't know who to put at the top of the bill. That's the that's my hesitation, or at least my guess as to why they are hesitant to pull the trigger on Italy. But it'll be interesting to see where else they go internationally. It's good to see that they did France and it went well. It went off with on a hitch. It seemed that the crowd absolutely loved it. And what was cool to hear David Shaw talk about was that aired in prime time in France on free-to-air TV, which I think we're going to be seeing more of in these other countries, the UFC being accessible, without a cable or streaming subscription, which kind of goes back to my point last week of one of the problems with the UFC is there's not enough accessible ways to watch it if you're in the United States. But if you go to all these other countries, it's like low hanging fruit. So yeah, overall, a decent show. If I were to give it a letter grade, I would give it a B plus.
I'd probably say the same. Also, by the way, one came to my mind. I want to see the UFC return to Japan.
Yeah, he had mentioned that as well, and I think if they did a card in Japan, that would be awesome, especially if you have Wei Lee as the headliner. That would be phenomenal. Yeah.
All right, moving on from UFC Paris. It's time to talk about Nate Diaz. No, not about his fight coming up on Saturday. We'll get into UFC 279 in a little bit, but we do have to talk about perhaps the biggest headline outside of all of the UFC Paris and UFC 279 talk. Nate Diaz, it seems, after his fighting days with the UFC ends, seemingly after Saturday, is going to be launching his own MMA promotion, fight promotion called Real Fights Inc. And kind of a lot of emphasis on real, because Nate Diaz has always said that basically he's a real fighter, a real gangster, that basically a lot of this is going to focus on real fighters, real MMA, real boxing, real jiu-jitsu, real. The word is real.
Yeah, as I was going to say, or as he likes to say, it's in, I don't know if this is the exact phrase, but he likes to put it as like real gangsters, real fights, real ninjas, real shit, or something like that.
It was something along those lines. Yeah.
So obviously, hearing that from Nate Diaz, he has his, I guess you could say, priorities straight. But I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts of this, because I'm kind of curious if this is going to be, a rival to the UFC, a smaller show that gets prospects of the rankings. Is it going to be these freak show one-off fights? Because honestly, if it's these freak show one-off fights for Nate Diaz is standing there in the middle as a promoter, I'm all in. I'm all in for that. I want to see some OG shit.
Zen, I will throw you an idea. If we're talking about Nate Diaz and we're talking about real fights and we're talking about real gangsters, then if it's a freak show card, then in the main event of the first real fight show, we need Snoop Dogg as guest referee.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Not only do we need Snoop Dogg as guest referee, but we need an absolutely bonkers commentary team. And no, I'm not talking thriller. I'm talking musicians. I'm talking people that are super famous.
Well, I have an idea, Zan. I have a better idea. Since you brought up Triller and Snoop Dogg did commentary, why doesn't Snoop Dogg do double duty? He is a commentator as he's refereeing.
That would be the most astonishing thing to have ever been broadcasted in the history of combat sports TV, and probably one of the most viral videos for at least a couple of weeks.
I still can't get over his commentary from the Jake Paul, Nate Robinson.
That was absurd. And then, of course, if you want to go way back, his Snoopcast broadcast with Uriah Faber, a Data contenders were pure gold. So it's going to be interesting to see what Nate Diaz does. Apparently, he's going to apply for his promoter's license within the next couple of weeks. So now that leads me to my next question. Let's hypothetically say that Nate Diaz pulls a miracle and beats Hamza Chimaev. Now that he's launched his own promotion, do you think he's done with the UFC regardless of how this fight goes? Because he's talking Jake Paul. There's obviously this thing now. Nate Diaz has only ever wanted to fight, in his words, real fighters, and apparently the UFC won't give him that. So instead, they're like, "Let's throw you to Hamza Chimaev."
Yeah, and he is still to this day, he continues to say that basically he took the fight, but the Khamzat Chimaev was not his idea. This is what the UFC wants because the UFC wants, they want the professional wrestling thing, for Nate Diaz, the legend, to go out on his back to promote the new big star in Khamzat Chimaev. But I think, and he has said, I think he told ESPN, hey, maybe not the end, I'm still cool with Dana. We can work something out, but I do think that this is the end. Now, one other thing we're forgetting, Zan, especially if it's option number one, going back to what kind of promotion Real Fights is going to be, if they're going to try to be aggressive, be, a rival to the UFC, that this is not the first time that we've seen the name Diaz launch their own promotion. If you remember Nick Diaz launching, I think it was War MMA, and it only had one show, and there basically wasn't another show, and Dana White had that comment after, "Welcome to the money losing business."
Yeah, I remember that very well, and I remember that show being quite awful. To be honest with you, the pacing was slow, the fights weren't good. I really hope it's not a repeat of that. But ever since, I don't mean to delve off topic, but if we're just talking about rival promotions, it just seems like no matter what rival promotion that directly competes with the UFC, there hasn't really been a single one outside of maybe Strikeforce and maybe Pride that has been able to be successful while running against the UFC. And if they're going to try to compete, they're going to get absolutely smashed, which leads me to my next question. And I know that this is not one of our selected topics, but I have to ask, what the heck is going on with this WF World Fight League business? And do you think that potentially there could be some sort of collaboration where they make it an us against the world thing? Because Nate Diaz seems to be like one of those people where it's him against the world, and if the WFL investors want to do it, are you interested in seeing that?
I don't know. And going to your point that you were talking about, Zan, like I would be interested, but Pride was beating the UFC until really those, the Yakuza allegations came out that basically killed the promotion. Strikeforce tried to be a number two, but got bought out. Bellator has made its case for a number two, and you can say is the number two, but obviously not in the level of production or anything that the UFC is. So, it's just one of those things where I need to see results before I can declare something to be a true alternative and legit competition to the UFC. I mean, I think back to the world of professional wrestling, where after WCW and ECW went out, WWE was the strict number one. You had Impact Wrestling and Ring of Honor try, but WWE was the number one. New Japan was a legit number two, but they were only a number two, and it wasn't really until AEW and the cons came along that basically you had a true alternative and competitive solution.
Very true. Good point. Again, it's not speculation. He's actually doing this promotion, but it will be interesting to see what he actually does, who he puts in place, who the president of this Real Fights promotion is going to be. And honestly, he needs to get this president right, or whoever's going to run the business side of it, because if he doesn't, he's in major trouble. So, if he brings somebody back and I know this is going to sound really hilarious in me saying this, but if he brings in like a Bajorn Remney, he's already screwed.
Wow. Oh man, it's been a little while since I've heard the name Bjorn Rebney. Oh, but I
Yeah.
do like how you talked about presidents because speaking of presidents, Zan, you made a great transition into the next topic. So, the Financial Times has come out with a new feature on UFC President Dana White, kind of describing, how he got into the promotion game, how he got into, boxing. If you've ever heard the story about Dana White, how basically he grew up and how he got into boxing, and that's where he met the fighters and eventually met the Fertitas, took the jiu-jitsu class, and eventually found their way towards the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So, Zan, I'm going to say, well, actually, let me ask you first. What did you think of this piece that basically went into Dana, who he is, basically kind of describing him as a car salesman?
Yeah, it was a very interesting piece. A lot of it is stuff that I knew. I was more so reading it for the behind the scenes day in the life aspect of it, which they did go into pretty in depth, which I thought was awesome. But most of it I did know. But honestly, even to this day in 2022, there's still a ton that we don't know about the man himself, and I really do think that they tried to do a good job of doing that. I have to ask though, in your opinion, when long features like that come out about someone who's in such a position of power, at least for me, I take a lot of it with a grain of salt. But seeing what behind the scenes videos have come out about him, especially going back to the days of his video blogs, I feel like all of that stuff came to light. Do you think it was a decent piece?
I think so because I think it demonstrates just how different Dana is and from other bosses and not just Dana, but just how different this sport, this industry is compared to other industries out there. Do you remember when uh Elite XC fell because of those allegations. That base a fight fixing after Seth Petrozelli upset Kimbo Slice, and then we're talking about video vlogs, how basically he's going on that whole rant, red in the face against the Elite XC that was posted online. The rant, the that's fucking illegal rant.
Yeah, and what's funny about that video is whenever you find the original video, whoever posted it 12 years ago, that's their only video on their entire YouTube account, which I think is hilarious. I have to mention this to you too, and I was hoping you'd go there, but you
Yeah,
didn't.
sorry,
It,
saying, and
it,
I'm just saying. You know, imagine if something happened, a very controversial thing happened in Burger King. And then a day later you saw the CEO of McDonald's just ripping them to shreds in a video vlog, uncensored, unscripted, dropping F bombs, just getting into the camera, face full fronting camera. Imagine if something happened in the professional world.
oh, it
That
would be
that it wouldn't fly.
No, it wouldn't. I guess that's why. I guess that's why there really aren't any rules in the MMA business. It's just kind of what you can find. But I wanted to bring up one more point, and this video has tried to get deleted as many times as possible from the internet, but it still keeps coming back. The photo of um the photo of Dana White with the T-shirt that says "I killed them all." R.I.P. EDXC. That's where I thought you were going. That's where I thought you were going with that. But yeah, only in MMA will you ever see things remotely close to what I just described.
Yeah, like only in MMA can that be accepted. It can only in MMA can we accept. I mean, I don't know about compared to the other professional sports leagues out there. Like when Dana was having the beef with Tito,
Right.
would you see? Yeah, I mean, you can see maybe an NFL team owner having a feud, a tiff with one of the players. Like, have seen that, but I don't know about to the degree that we saw, with Dana and Tito, where it got to the point where it seemed like Dana and Tito were actually going to box one another.
Yeah, you just don't see that in other professional sports. I want to know from you too, because I don't know if I can really see this, but I would say relatively that I've followed the sport slightly longer than you have, I would say. So I was just curious, is there anything about that piece that you didn't know about Dana before reading it?
Not really. I knew about his upbringing. I mean, maybe the odd jobs that he worked before he got into the boxing, before he got into the boxing managing. But we've heard about Dana talk about how him being troubled, him getting into the wrong side of things, him getting on the wrong side of his mom, which I find funny that as much as he's on the wrong side of his mom, he won't say any bad thing about her. It's like, hey, he's not, in that area, he's not different from any of us.
What do you think of the angle of FT interviewing his sister Kelly in the same piece, which is someone that really nobody has any idea about? That's the very interesting part. But I don't know if you like that, but she was interviewed.
I did see that. I did see her make comments when they were talking about the subject of him and his mom's beef. I was a little surprised that they did that, but I actually think my initial reaction is good on them, for trying to get more of a story in there, because they also didn't back off later on when they were talking about, the class action lawsuit against the UFC, talking about bringing in, we even talked about it a couple weeks ago, bringing the Muhammad Ali Act into the UFC, getting an outside committee, an outside sanctioning body to rank fighters and give fighters more opportunities and more cross promotion opportunities.
Absolutely. I guess the one thing that I could end with is that I do think that when these big features of him come out, I think it's interesting how much more new information is put in all of them, because there have been several. The Las Vegas Sun or the Las Vegas Review Journal did one in 2009. The Baltimore Sun's done one before. The New York Times has done one before. Forbes has done one before. Obviously, the Financial Times just did this one. There's just a new video that was released yesterday about kind of or behind the scenes work into his life that GQ just did. So anything that really comes out about him, I think it's interesting to see all the new stuff that gets revealed, because I think a lot of it are things that a lot of people don't know, especially personally. And I don't know if you've ever heard him say this, but he likes to keep his family very much out of the spotlight. And I think he's done a pretty solid job doing that outside of their massive mega $1 million birthday parties that he throws for his kids. But
I mean,
yeah.
fair, but I think it's also just human curiosity. You see a figure like a Dana White who's so powerful or so charismatic that basically you kind of want to get into their mindsets. I mean, again, to make allusion to the wrestling world before his little fall from grace a few months ago, Vince McMahon, that he's just so out there that it's like, I want to get into a head. I want to be a fly on the wall following him around in his daily life. It's like one of those things that you have with Dana. Like, we want to get into what is Dana White about, and I think this piece by the Financial Times kind of captures it a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm lucky enough to say that I had 5 or 10 minutes with the man himself about 10 or so years ago, and I gotta say he's just as intimidating in person as he is on TV. I have to say though, his hand was massive and he looked like he was in tons of pain. And I met him because he was still recovering from his Meniere's disease, which he ended up getting fixed shortly thereafter. But just to be able to shake his hand, I'm like, wow, I just met someone that was worth a lot of money and is probably one of the most powerful fight promoters, if not the most powerful fight promoter of all time.
It certainly was an interesting feeling being there on the docks for the UFC 244 presser, getting to ask him a question, because you know not everybody gets easy access to Dana White, so it's like getting to ask him a question. It's like, how many opportunities do you get unless you're a John Morgan or
John Morgan, Aaron
Bronstetter, yeah. Kevin Iole.
Kevin Iole, and it's crazy. Kevin Iole is the one reporter that he's spoken to probably every year for the last 20 years. He's literally been there since Zuffa bought the company, which is crazy that Iole is really the only media member, or one of the few media members that Dana White actually respects. Well, yeah, I gotta say he's a very interesting character, and whether you like him or hate him, you always have an opinion of him. And I guess I can say that another MMA life goal was achieved for me a couple months ago when I told Dana White that he should put the Agent Orange concert on the monitor next to him, and he thought it was a great idea.
All right. Before we get into the big UFC weekend, some news and notes that, from last week and this week for Bellator. They have released their schedule for the rest of the year. So in about 2 weeks' time, we have Bellator 285 coming up at the 3 Arena in Dublin. That will be headlined by Henderson and Queally. UFC 286 is going to be Pitbull versus Borix at the Long Beach Arena in California. That is a featherweight championship fight. Plus, we got AJ.
What's the date on 286?
286. That will be Saturday, October 1st. Also, that's Pitbull versus Borix headlining. Co-main event: AJ McKee, Spark Carlisle, as well as Aaron Pico versus Jeremy Kennedy, and Juan Archuleta versus Enrique Barzola. So that's a pretty nice Bellator card there on October 1st.
Agreed.
Bellator 287. Bellator returns to it's Italy, like I mentioned before. Headlined by Adam Piccolotti versus Mansour Barnoui, Fabian Edwards and Charlie Ward co-main. Saul Rogers on the card as well. But the two bigger ones are for the end of the year. Bellator 288 in good old Chicago, Illinois. Zan, I know you have a big interest in going there. Double title fight. Vadim Nemkov, Corey Anderson. They're running it back. We need a light heavyweight Grand Prix champion. We need a tournament winner. And we need an undisputed light heavyweight champion. We will get that on that card.
Hopefully, knock on wood.
There. Co-main event will be another title fight. It'll be for the lightweight title. Patricky Pitbull versus Usman Nurmagomedov. Is this the first time, Zan, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have double Pitbull brothers, double champions?
Yeah, I would, if I were to guess, I would say 100%. And I have to tell you, I've been to some Bellator cards in the past. I've been to Rampage King Mo. I've been to Fedor versus Frank Mir. I've been to a couple of them, and I'd say if I get approved to go to this Bellator event, it will be the biggest Bellator event that I will have ever been to, and I am just counting down the days until that event, because Chicago is getting a mega card in those two fights. If I can go to that event, I would be super, super, super grateful. I just think overall Bellator is stacked at the end of the year, and I'm really grateful that they made Chicago a priority. It'll be the first time in about 3.5 years, and yeah, I have big interest in going to Bellator 288, and I am so jacked for that Nurmagomedov Pitbull fight. You have no idea. So I am very much looking forward to November 18th. Absolutely.
I was gonna say, just the fact that it's let alone the fact that it's in Chicago, just those two fights alone, they have the opportunity to build one of the biggest Bellator cards of all time, especially when there's two title fights. Bellator 289, final Bellator card of the year, December 9th, Friday, one day before the UFC's final pay-per-view of the year. It's going to be Rafion Starks versus Danny Sabatello for the interim Bellator Bantamweight Championship, and Patchy Mix versus Magomedov, two Bantamweight World Grand Prix fights. And, just knowing who Rafion is, knowing who Danny Sabatello is, the charisma that both of them have, and the two of them just clashing, with having the war of words on Ariel Helwani show and across the other media platforms. That's going to be an entertaining way to end the year for Bellator.
Oh, absolutely. And I could only dream of that exact fight being in Chicago, but I'm okay. I'm okay with that. I'm just excited that the fight's gonna happen, and they almost went in it on the MMA Hour last week, and that made for some very entertaining social media banter and social media interaction. That build up to that fight might be the biggest build up in the history of that company. It's sort of looking like it might be the biggest build up that potentially they've ever done. And I mean bar none. But that'll be awesome. I really do think Bellator has stepped up their game a whole lot more, and I think those cards are cards that a lot of people should be excited for. I'm particularly excited for that Edwards Charlie Ward fight. That's gonna be fun too.
All right, Zain, we have waited long enough. You all out there have waited long enough. It is time. It is time to discuss UFC 279, Chimaev versus Diaz. So, we got to talk about, of course, the one fight, the main event. I will say, not my favorite card. I know Nate Diaz has the capability of, producing a lot of buys, even without a title fight. I know Khamzat Chimaev is the next big thing for the UFC, well, one of the next big things. But just looking at the card, not my favorite of this year, but still, Khamzat Chimaev, Nate Diaz, a lot of hype around it. As I mentioned before, Nate Diaz, final fight on the contract. Looks like he's out the door. And maybe the UFC wants him to put over one of their new golden boys in Khamzat Chimaev on the way out. So the betting odds here, minus 1,200 for Khamzat Chimaev, plus 725 for Nate Diaz. Chimaev, 2-inch height advantage, and Diaz has a 1-inch reach advantage. Fight contested at welterweight. Zain, thoughts?
Well, first off, I think whoever made these odds are insane. Because if anybody's ever watched a Nate Diaz fight, they know that when he's back against the wall, he thrives. I mean, Exhibit A to this was UFC 196 on 10 days' notice when he upset Conor McGregor in that epic first of two fights that they had. And I just feel like a lot of people are underestimating Diaz. He has way more experience. He's been with the UFC since 2000, and it's about 2006 or so. Was on the Ultimate Fighter, and Khamzat Chimaev is another up and coming stud who just came off a big win against Gilbert Burns. I mean, this fight has all the makings of an instant classic. I could see this ending in multiple ways. I could see Khamzat Chimaev winning in the first round by whatever he wants. I could see Nate Diaz winning this fight in the second or third round by submission if he somehow gasses Khamzat out, or I could see this fight going the distance, and you have absolute madness at the T-Mobile Arena. But there are a lot of different ways this fight can go, but I really do feel like if Nate Diaz brings the heart and energy that MMA fans know and love about him, there's no way in the world that this fight is not boring. I'm not saying that Nate Diaz is going to win, but if you want to put a sprinkle and you want to somehow get massively rich this weekend, that might be the way to go. But if you want to go the safer route, Khamzat Chimaev by any method of finish might be the way to go if you're just looking to put some scraps on the main event, if you will. It should be a banger of a main event. That's what
Absolutely.
I think.
Absolutely. It is an absolute banger of a main event. I don't like the odds, but I understand where they're going for. Is that Hamzat is younger. He's the new face that runs the place. And Nate Diaz on the way out. UFC trying to build up the hype train for Hamzat Chimaev. Maybe get him. We talked about it when Usman and Edwards happened, that maybe Chimaev can get his way to the winner of the Usman Edwards rematch.
And
But
now it's like if Hamzat wins, imagine this. All Hamzat has to do is hope and pray that Edwards beats Usman again, and then he pretty much has a walk-in title fight with the new champion in Edwards, which is likely exactly what the UFC wants, because they knew that if Hamzat fought Usman, that it would be a much different fight. I know we're playing hypotheticals here, but I think scenario-wise, this is exactly what the UFC is looking for now, given that their champion in Edwards is not as big of a star as, maybe Usman or Covington, if you will.
for sure, I can see where we're going with that. I just don't know. Do you think I'll throw it to you, Zan? Do you think Chimaev can finish Diaz?
I can, but I think it's going to be harder than what people will think, just because of how tough and durable Diaz is.
Right. It's because let's think about this. Yes, Nate Diaz got stopped by George Masvidal, and the fight will go down in the record books as a TKO via doctor stoppage.
Which was silly. And
right, I was gonna say, which it will go down via TKO. It will go down as a finish. If you bet TKO for Masvidal, you won money that night. But I do think the New York Athletic Commission was being a little silly over the kind of cut that was unleashed. Now, he did go 5 rounds, Nate did, with the current champion himself, Leon Edwards. Leon, started off very well, but it ultimately ended up going the distance. And Nate surprised in that 5th round by, dropping Edwards and rocking him. So my feeling is if he was able to go the distance with Leon, and his one recent, loss via finish was the controversial doctor stoppage in New York. My gut is telling me, to go the distance. My gut's telling me go the distance. I'm in this fight, that I can see Chimaev pulling off the finish, but my gut is telling me go the distance. Go to this. This is Nate Diaz. They're going to put on a 5-round war. At least that's what I'm praying for.
Could you see in some way, form, or fashion Nate Diaz walking out of the T-Mobile Arena as the winner of this fight?
In some way, yes. Do I think it's going to happen? Do I expect it to happen? Doubt it.
I agree. I agree with that. Another play that I like is the over 1.5 rounds.
Over. I know Chimaev is, has great finishing ability, but like I said, not everybody can finish Nate Diaz, and it's going to take somebody. It's going to take somebody, really, really special. If Hamzat Chimaev pulls off a 1st-round finish on Nate Diaz, then there's no question. I'll be stunned, and there'll be no question that Chimaev will be the next big thing of the UFC if that was to happen.
I agree. So now let me ask you this: with all of the controversy, back and forth, bad blood, contract negotiations, all of that stuff, you throw all that the window. You throw all of that out the window. I feel like we're in for a good old-fashioned street fight on Saturday night. That's what I think.
I expect a brawl.
That's what I think. I think you can expect a brawl, and you can expect just a couple middle fingers to be shown at various different parties in the middle of that fight. And I can see some talking going on, because as you know, Hamzat likes to talk as he wrestles people. So
I was gonna say that's the other thing I can see. I can see a lot of brawling, and I can see a lot of pummeling, where one guy tries to get the other against the fence and just hammer away. I could see Hamza trying to do that to Nate, and then Nate just saying, no, screw you, and just blasting him back.
All right. Well, to wrap up this fight in particular, do you have a final prediction and a best bet on the main event between Hamzat and Mr. Diaz?
I am going to go Hamzat Chimaev by unanimous decision.
Okay, I'm going to go with Hamzat Chimaev via 4th round TKO. And if you want to go save for a best bet, I think Chimaev versus Diaz over 1.5 rounds.
I think that's our lock. This over under of 1.5 rounds is a little ridiculous.
Agreed.
Should be over. Co-main event. Let's talk about Tony Ferguson versus Li Jingliang. Tony Ferguson making his welterweight debut. And we talked about this fight when it was announced a few weeks ago, and we said we really don't know how to feel about Tony Ferguson making this step up to welterweights. And in typical UFC fashion, and first fight for a former champion in a new weight class is not an easy task. And this smells like, in my opinion, trouble for Ferguson.
Yeah, they give him a stud, and considering how bad Ferguson's last knockout was, he needs to be very careful because the Leech is a dude. You don't want to mess with him anywhere. Standing, goes to the ground, whatever. He keeps a ferocious pace, and it showed in his last couple of fights. He's been in some absolute wars. We can take a look at it. His last fight was against Muslim Salikov. That was a great fight. Santiago Ponzinibbio gave him trouble. But he was able to get the stoppage there. He fought Hamzat, lost a rear naked choke. The same Hamzat who's fighting in the main event. He's fought studs in the welterweight division ever since signing with the UFC, including Neil Magny. And this is another massive fight for the Leech. And honestly, Ferguson is going to be the biggest name that he's ever fought. And I think that if you're an MMA purist, this feels to me like slowly but surely it's the beginning of the end. And if he loses another one to make it 5 straight losses and beating Donald Cerrone at that fateful UFC event in Chicago, it looks to me like, could you potentially see Tony Ferguson on his way out of the sport? If
I will give you Zain, I will give you a take. I think it is a little past time. I feel like he should have retired after the Chandler loss. If he loses to Li Jingliang, especially if he gets finished violently, like Jingliang has finishes to his record. And as we said, Ferguson has taken a lot of damage. If Ferguson gets finished here again, there can't be another question. I already don't feel safe for him taking more fights anyways. If he loses again and gets finished again, I think somebody has to step in and say, you're cut off. You're done. You can't do this anymore. Not, especially also considering, it was only a few years ago where we were really concerned about Ferguson's mental health.
True. I like in this fight, as much as I'd like to see Ferguson win, I like the Leech to win in the early part of the second round by KO, TKO, and it's going to be a nasty finish in my opinion.
Zan, let's lock it in. I think that is a best bet for the MMA Outsiders this week. Li Jingliang, second round KO TKO. I think we got to go with that.
I agree, and I think the round makes a lot of sense considering how much high energy there will be in the first round, and both of them will be trying to finish each other. But I just feel like the clock will run out before the second, and then the second is when the fight will really take a dramatic turn and head towards a finish. So yeah, I do like Li Jingliang. As does Tom, by second round KO TKO.
For sure. All right. It seems my Tapology tab is kind of... Oh, there we go. I was going through all the different
By the way, for those of you guys who are hearing us for the first time and are MMA fans but don't know what Tapology is, go check it out. It's a super interactive site. It has every single fight card that you could possibly think of, from the amateurs all the way up to the number 1 and number 2 promotions in the world. You're a one-stop shop for every single fight card that you can possibly think of. It might be one of the most well-made MMA database sites that I have ever and it probably is the best one in the entire world.
For sure. All right. Zan, look at the rest of this card. Like I said, this really isn't my favorite card compared to all the other, cards that we've been blessed with as of late. But interesting rest of the main card where you got Kevin Holland, Daniel Rodriguez, Irene Aldana taking on Macy Chiasson, and Johnny Walker taking on Ian Cutelaba. Do any of these fights interest you?
Before I answer your question, I just want to let you know I saw a 3-leg underdog parlay yesterday for $100 to win $30,000 that had Nate Diaz on the ticket, Tony Ferguson on the ticket, and Chris Barnett. If you parlay all of those together, $100, that's you $30,000. So if you want to go crazy and be a real degenerate this weekend and bet all dogs, that's the all dog parlay for UFC 279. I'm not encouraging it. I will not go that route because I know I will get smoked. But if you are that crazy to drop $100 on 3 dogs, that's the payout. It was about $30,700.
Just remember, there is a reason that it is a high payout, and they're dogs. Just remember that. Don't go dog chasing.
So yeah, so the fight the fight that interests me the most is out of that is in the top 2. Hard not to love Kevin Holland versus Daniel Rodriguez. Both of these guys bring it every single time, especially Holland, who Dana White dubbed his big mouth. And obviously, as you guys know the story of that, when Thiago Santos' opponent pulls out of the fight, Dana goes around and asks every single light heavyweight in the book, and he goes to Mick Maynard and Sean Shelby and says, "Call Big Mouth. Let's see if Big Mouth takes this fight." Goes 3 rounds with Thiago Santos, drops him and hurts him, almost wins that fight, and then goes on to have the craziest 2020 that anybody has ever seen.
For sure. Kevin Holland, there was once a time, after his crazy 2020 that he was struggling. Lost to Derek Brunson, lost to Marvin Vettori. The Kyle Dawkins fight goes to a no contest. But he's coming off wins off of Alex Oliveira and Tim Means. So for him, this is a chance to get back to, a true winning streak. But Daniel Rodriguez is one tough cookie. He has won, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. He's won 11 of his last 12. Wins over Mike Perry, Preston Parsons, Dwight Grant, Gabe Green, Kevin Lee. So for him, he's coming in with a lot of momentum.
Yeah,
he's
fought some relatively big names, including a former interim champion. It's hard not to like what he's done in the sport so far. Absolutely.
I think the question is one of these guys capable of finishing the other? Because I want to think about a go to distance or don't go to distance prop. That's the first thing my mind is drawn to.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a curveball at you. Could you see this going over 2.5 rounds?
Ooh. I can see it. I don't know if I want to place money on that though.
I understand. And we don't know this because the video isn't out. But if I were to guess, Dana White's, if you don't know now, you know for this week, this is going to be one of the fights.
You gotta watch this fight. I will say, however, that this is basically a sleeper pick for fight of the night. I know Chimaev versus Diaz is the obvious choice and probably will end up being fight of the night. But I feel like this one is a sleeper second.
Agreed. Can you go back to the card? There's one more fight that I'm particularly really interested in.
Absolutely. Which is that?
So I'm gonna go with the Johnny Walker versus Ian Cutelaba fight.
I agree. I agree.
Which will be the second fight on the pay-per-view, I'm pretty sure.
No, I think they're the opener. I think the women's fight is going second. According to what I have here.
Okay. Yeah, obviously, as everybody knows, the UFC order randomly changes 2 days before. And
I was going to say that the greatest words of combat sport. Well, I shouldn't say greatest, but card subject to change.
Yeah, and it literally changes every single week. If anybody wants to know anything about card lineups and you are on Twitter, Marcel Dorf is your guy for that. He has every update of every single UFC event, rankings, fight announcements. As well, he's one of the best independent MMA media sources that we probably have, and that we are very lucky to have. As he'll have obviously the updated card of the day of the fight, but you never know. Some of these could easily change.
So, Johnny Walker, I mean, what to say about Johnny Walker? I remember being there at the UFC 244 media day, and it was like, if he gets the win over Corey Anderson, could he fight John Jones? And then Corey Anderson happened and reminded us there are levels to this game. And then now he's lost quite a bit. Lost 4 of his last 5. Ion Cutelaba, I mean, you know, he was once on a, you know, he looked like he was going to have a good win streak himself, but then came the controversial, I mean, he was on good winning ways, and then the controversial Magomed Ankalaev fights, draws with Dustin Jacoby, defeats Devin Clark, lost to Ryan Spann. Not bad, but still could be better. But Ion Cutelaba, the Hulk's recent run of things, momentum, still a lot better than Johnny Walker. And, you know, I'll throw it to you, Zan. Is this a do or die fight for Johnny Walker?
Yeah, and Cutelaba is no easy task. I think we're talking about going the distance props. This whole preview, this fight, no question about it.
No way. That's another best bet. Then don't go to distance. This one
99.999%. This fight not go distance, and if it does, I might have to throw something in the air in disbelief, because there's no way that this fight isn't exciting.
I mean, you know, I'm fairly certain that this fight does not go the distance. I am more certain that this fight will not go the distance. I'm as certain of that as I'm certain that the Ravens and Titans are going to blow the Jets and Giants out of the water on Sunday. Which is fairly certain.
Yeah, I could see both of those outcomes happening. And if you want to add one more NFL spin to this, I guess you could add the Bengals beating the Steelers. That's how much I'm confident in these 4 equivalent.
Wait, are you saying the Bengals aren't going to beat the Steelers, or are going to beat the Steelers?
No, they are. No, they will. I'm just
okay.
I'm just saying that you're saying that this is as much of a guarantee as the Ravens as the Ravens game.
I just got worried, Dan. I just got worried that my "don't disrespect the Bengals" run was going to have to make its way from ETV to here.
No, you're not. No, you're not. You're not being disrespected by the Bengals. At least for this week, as we approach very closely week number 1 of the 2022 NFL season. But I digress. One thing I wanted to mention before we get out of here is on fight day. Do you have any sort of UFC rituals that you always do? I have a few unique ones, so I just have to ask.
Sometimes I'll listen to music to get myself, you know, in the mood right before the card starts. And then I have like certain spots in my house where I'll watch it just to get a nice viewing experience and hopefully not as much internet interference. ESPN Plus.
Interesting. So what I like to do, and I don't know if you know this, but I like to play the intro for the UFC pay-per-views.
Oh, the old intro with the Gladiator?
Well, that, and also I like to do the whole sequence where you do the who first, and then you do Face the Pain, and then you switch the input over to whatever the pay-per-view is. It's always the best way to do it. Another ritual that I guess I have is or I've been bad at it the last couple of shows, but what I like to do is I like to wait until Saturday watch the countdown for the very first time, to remind myself that, oh yeah, there is a card tonight.
Make it like a legitimate pre-show.
Yeah, and it's only going to happen in 7 hours. Oh yeah, and then I guess the final thing that I like to do for cards like this is I like to kind of look at, I'm a little bit weird in terms of history, so I like to look at what cards have taken place like in this same realm or in that same weekend, just to remind myself, yeah, September is either a good month or a bad month for the UFC in the past, and it usually works out well. I guess one of the final things that I'll mention is UFC 279 really does feel like kind of a recreated version of UFC 196 in so many ways. It feels like it has that energy to it, and it'll be interesting to see at the press conference on Thursday if my proclamations prove to be correct. I do feel like, though, this is one of those cards that just for the main event alone, you can't miss if you're an MMA fan. And if you're someone that's never seen the sport before, that wants to see a very interesting main event, this is easily a good fight to be introduced to, and hopefully one that won't be boring by any means. And what's nice too is you don't really have a ton of stuff conflicting with it, so it should be a pretty solid weekend of MMA of sorts, and it should be a card that hopefully is a memorable one as the UFC schedule gets back on track slowly but surely. It's going to ramp up here soon, but the month of September, I think, is going to drag a little bit. So we'll see.
I agree. So make sure to hit that like button. Make sure to subscribe. Make sure to ring the bell when you subscribe, so that way you get notified for all the streams on the Empty the Bench network, from us here at the MMA Outsiders to Empty the Bench, Beyond the Bench, Game On, Living Life, Rudy Ciryl, all that and so much more. Again, you can find my work at Fansided MMA, and you can
find my work over at BJPen.com. I'm a recently joined staff writer within the last month. We have some interesting things coming out over the next several days. So if you want your double dose of MMA content, you can find all of our work there. And not only do we feel like we are passionate observers of the sport, but we try to cover the sport in the best way we can. And we feel like being with those sites and doing this podcast is only going to help the growth of the sport. And I've heard it, so be sure that if you have never heard of those sites, please do your research and please find our work. We would greatly appreciate it.
And make sure to follow us at MMA Outsiders ETV. Follow along with us as the card goes down on Saturday, posting all the highlights. The Sunday morning after, about 9 o'clock, I will have another one of those moment of mayhems, like I did for Leon Edwards' upset. And of course, come back here next week to the MMA Outsiders, where we will run everything down as to what happened and recap all the action. But for Zain Bando, I'm Tom Albano, and remember, be Joe Piper.
Be Joe Piper. Have a good one, everybody, and please enjoy UFC 279. And please, as Yanni the Greek likes to say, don't trash them, cash them.
Enjoy the fights this weekend, everybody. We'll see you next week. Take care.